At 73 years old, Genevieve Harshaw had spent her whole life keeping things together for other people. Then her own son had her evicted. With a suitcase in her back seat and nowhere to go, she drove 4 hours into the West Virginia hill country to her late father's abandoned Watermill, a place she hadn't visited in over a decade. She expected to find rotting wood and silence. Instead, when she stepped out of the car and looked down at the creek, the old wheel was turning. What Genny built inside that mill over the months that followed would leave an entire county speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Genevieve Harshaw was handed the final eviction notice, the temperature outside sat at 34 degrees, and a thin frost had settled across her windshield. She stood in the hallway of the house she had lived in for 29 years and read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it on the kitchen table, and sat down. She was 73 years old. She had nowhere to go. The house on Garner Mill Road in Evicted, West Virginia, was not a large house. 2 bedrooms, a narrow bathroom, a kitchen where the linoleum had warped near the sink, and a front porch she had screened in herself one summer in the mid-90s with her husband Douglas's help. They had bought it together in 1994 when the asking price was $87,000, and they scraped together the down payment from 3 years of savings and a small loan from Douglas's mother. It wasn't elegant, but it was theirs, and they had poured everything they had into it over nearly 3 decades. New gutters in 2002, a repainted exterior in 2009, the vegetable garden along the south-facing fence that Genny had tended every spring for almost 30 years. Douglas had died 4 years earlier. A stroke, fast and without warning. He was 72, and one morning he was there, and that afternoon he wasn't. The house after that felt too large and too still, but Genny had never once considered leaving. Her garden was there. Her neighbors were there. 29 years of ordinary life were layered into every corner of the place, and she was not ready to give any of that up. What she didn't know, through the first 2 years of widowhood, was that Owen had been watching all of it the way a man watches an opportunity. Owen Harshaw was 47 years old and had been in some kind of financial trouble for most of his adult life. He had a talent for starting things he didn't finish and borrowing money he couldn't repay. Douglas had covered for him twice without making a fuss about it. Genny had done it once herself, writing a check she told no one about. She had always told herself Owen was just finding his footing. He was her son. She held on to that longer than she should have. 14 months after Douglas's funeral, Owen came to Evicted for a visit. He brought flowers, which he never usually did, and he made dinner, which he had never once done before. Over the meal, he talked about how worried he was. She was alone in a house too big for one person, he said. Things needed upkeep she couldn't manage herself. He had been talking to a lawyer friend, just informally, just to make sure she was protected. There were some documents, he said, a formality, a way for him to step in and handle things if she ever got sick or confused. She shouldn't have to deal with legal paperwork on her own. Genny was tired. She had been tired for 14 months. Owen was sitting across from her with his father's eyes, and he looked, in that moment, like the son she had always hoped he would become. She signed the power of attorney papers. She would not fully understand what she had signed for another 16 months, when a certified letter arrived from a title company in Charleston informing her that the property at 412 Garner Mill Road had been conveyed and that she had 30 days to vacate the premises. She called Owen from the kitchen, standing at the counter where she had stood for 29 years. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was even and prepared in a way that told her he had been expecting the call. Genny told him there had to be a mistake. Owen told her there was no mistake. She told him she had never agreed to sell the house. He said she had signed the authority for him to make that call, and he had made it. The proceeds had already gone toward resolving his debts, which were, he explained in the same even voice, more serious than she had known. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after he hung up. She called a lawyer in Evicted 2 days later, a woman named Jan Fetters who had an office above the hardware store on Main Street. Fetters laid it out plainly. The power of attorney was valid. The sale was legal. To challenge it, Genny would need to prove Owen had acted fraudulently or that she lacked mental capacity when she signed. Either path would cost money she no longer had access to, and take time the eviction clock was not giving her. She called 3 friends. She called her pastor. She looked into a senior housing complex in Beckley and was told the wait list was 8 months long. On the last morning, she packed 1 suitcase. Clothes, her reading glasses, a photograph of Douglas from the summer of 1998, and her father's old watch. Cornelius Harshaw had worn that watch every day of his working life and left it to her when he died 12 years ago, and she had kept it in the drawer beside her bed ever since. She locked the front door out of habit, then remembered she had no key rights anymore and left the key under the mat the way the title company had asked. She sat in her car in the driveway. The vegetable garden was visible from where she parked. The rosemary she had planted in 2003 had gone gray at the base but was still alive. She sat there without thinking in any organized way, just sitting. Then a memory came to her, specific and clear. Her father standing at a creek in the early morning with his sleeves rolled up, the water wheel turning steadily behind him. The old mill on Tanner's Run, up in the hill country 4 hours north. She had inherited it when Cornelius died. She had never sold it, never really thought much about it, never gone back after the funeral. She started the car. Genevieve Harshaw was born in 1952 in a 2-room house at the edge of Cedarford, the second of 4 children belonging to Cornelius and Lena Harshaw. Cornelius ran the Watermill on Tanner's Run, a stone and timber operation that had been the family since the 1930s, grinding corn and wheat for the farms spread across the surrounding hill country. It was not a prosperous living, but it was a reliable one, and Cornelius ran it with the kind of steady attention that left no room for complaint. He was up before sunrise every day of Genny's childhood. She could not remember a single morning when she woke before him. Lena kept the house and worked part-time at the general store in town. Between the 2 of them, they kept the family fed and clothed and in school, which in Cedarford in the 1950s and 60s was not something every family managed. Genny was a good student, the kind who finished her work early and then read whatever she could find. She loved mathematics and, later, bookkeeping, the way numbers told the truth about things when words could be fudged. After high school, she took a job at the county clerk's office handling property records and stayed there for 6 years. She met Douglas Harshaw at a church potluck in 1978. He was from Morgantown originally, had come down to Cedarford to work at a surveying firm, and he had a way of listening to people that made them feel like what they were saying actually mattered. They talked for 3 hours that evening about nothing in particular and everything at once. And by the end of the night, Genny had decided he was worth paying attention to. They were married 11 months later in the same church where they had met, with Cornelius in the front pew, wearing his good suit and his watch. Douglas was a careful, steady man who worked hard and didn't waste much. He moved into the county assessor's office after a few years at the surveying firm, and Genny kept her position at the clerk's office, and together they saved enough to buy the house on Garner Mill Road in 1994. It was the only house they ever owned, and they treated it accordingly. Every repair they could make themselves, they made themselves. Every dollar they could save, they saved. They were not wealthy people. They were people who knew the difference between what they needed and what they merely wanted, and they lived by that distinction without making a performance of it. Owen came along in 1977, a year before Genny and Douglas even met. He was the product of a brief relationship Genny never spoke about in detail, and she had raised him alone for the first 2 years of his life before Douglas came into the picture. Douglas adopted Owen formally in 1980 and treated him without distinction from that day forward. Whatever Owen needed, Douglas made sure he had it. The trouble was that Owen needed more than most. Not materially, not exactly. He was smart enough. He had a certain charm that opened doors. But he had no tolerance for the slow work of following through on things, and he spent most of his 20s and 30s burning through the goodwill that charm earned him. A landscaping business that collapsed after 2 seasons. A restaurant partnership that ended in a lawsuit. A marriage that lasted 4 years and produced no children and a fair amount of debt. Douglas had paid off 2 of Owen's worst obligations without telling Genny until they were already settled. She found out about the second one only because she stumbled across the bank transfer while reconciling their accounts. She and Douglas argued about it once, properly. She told them they were not doing Owen any favors by cushioning every fall. Douglas said maybe not, but he wasn't going to watch his son drown if he had the means to throw a rope. They left it there, as they left most of their disagreements, with both of them still holding their own position but choosing to stop pressing. After Douglas died, Genny assumed Owen would level out. He was 43. The hard years were supposed to be behind him. He came to the funeral and stayed for a week, and during that week he was attentive and present in a way that Genny found comforting. She told a friend afterward that maybe losing Douglas had been the thing to finally settle Owen down. She was wrong about that. What she had read as grief was something else, or at least something mixed. Owen had watched his father manage the family's finances for years, and he knew what there was to know. The house had equity, his mother was alone, and she was, in the fog of fresh loss, more trusting than she would otherwise have been. He was not calculating in some cold and villainous way. He was desperate, and he was selfish, which is a different thing, though the result tends to look the same from the outside. Genny spent the years between Douglas's death and the eviction notice believing she was being looked after. She cooked for herself, kept up the garden, called Owen every Sunday. She thought she was grieving and healing and slowly finding her footing again. She was in fact being managed. By the time the letter arrived from the title company, Owen had already spent the money. There was nothing left to reclaim and no softness in him about what he had done. He had solved his problem. That he had created a worse one for his mother was not, as far as Genny could tell, something that kept him up at night. She had raised him in that house on Garner Mill Road. She had fed him at that kitchen table. She drove north toward the mill and did not look back. The drive from Cedarford to Tanner's Run took 4 hours and 12 minutes. Not that Genny was counting. She took Route 60 west out of town and then picked up a series of state roads that climbed steadily into the hill country, the kind of roads that narrowed as they went and lost their center line somewhere around the second hour. The mountains in early November were stripped of color. The trees had dropped most of their leaves and stood gray and bare against the sky, the same pale shade as old concrete. Genny drove with the heat on low and the radio off. She had not eaten since the previous evening. She hadn't noticed until somewhere around the second hour, when a faint hollow feeling made itself known behind her ribs, and she stopped at a gas station outside of town called Fenwick and bought a granola bar and a cup of coffee from a machine that dispensed both with equal indifference. She ate in the car in the parking lot, watching a dog sleep on a concrete step across the road. Then she drove on. She had not been back to Tanner's Run since her father's funeral 12 years ago. Cornelius had died in late October, and the burial had been in Cedarford, but a small group of people who had known him through the mill had gathered at the property afterward, standing in the yard with paper cups of coffee while the creek moved past them and the wheels sat still. Someone had already cut the water gate by then to stop the wheel from turning. It had seemed like the right thing to do. The mill, without Cornelius running, it was not a mill anymore. It was just a building. Genny had inherited it in the will along with a modest amount of cash, most of which had gone toward the funeral and the legal fees that came after. She had thought about selling the property more than once over the years, but something always stopped her. She couldn't have named it precisely. The mill had no great sentimental value in the way that a family photograph or a piece of jewelry might. It was just a place. But it was a place that had shaped how she understood work and time and the idea of showing up for things, and she was not able to put a price on that without feeling like she was selling something she hadn't properly accounted for yet. Now she was driving toward it with a suitcase in her back seat and $30 left in her wallet and no other plan. The turnoff for the mill property was a gravel lane that branched off County Road 7 about 3 miles past the Fenwick town limit. Genny almost missed it. The lane was partially blocked by a low-hanging branch she didn't remember being there, and the gravel had grown over at the edges so that it looked more like a wide footpath than a road. She slowed the car, pulled onto the gravel, and drove the quarter-mile down to the property with branches scraping both sides of the Civic. The mill sat at the bottom of a gentle slope, maybe 40 yards back from Tanner's Run. It was a 2-story timber frame structure with stone foundation walls that her grandfather had laid by hand sometime in the 1930s, according to what Cornelius had always said. The siding had been white once. It was gray now, weathered to the color of driftwood, and in a few places along the lower section the boards had warped away from the frame and left gaps. The roof looked sound from a distance. The windows on the ground floor were shuttered with old wooden panels, and the door that faced the yard was held shut by a padlock that Genny recognized as one she had bought herself and mailed to her father years ago after the original lock broke. She sat in the car with the engine running and looked at the building for a long moment. It was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was different and the building was the same. She had last seen it as a daughter coming to bury her father. She was seeing it now as a woman with nowhere else to go, and that changed the geometry of the thing. She turned off the engine and got out. The cold hit her immediately, sharper than it had been in Cetaphil, the way cold always hits harder near moving water. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the building, her feet loud on the frozen ground. The yard was overgrown, knee-high grass gone stiff and brown, a rusted metal drum half buried near the wood line. The old equipment shed to the north of the main building had partially collapsed, one wall leaning inward at an angle that suggested it had been a gradual process over many years. She was almost at the mill door when she heard it. She stopped walking. The sound was low and rhythmic, a heavy turning, wood and water working together in the way she had heard 10,000 times as a child without ever really registering it. She turned toward the creek. The wheel was moving. Not fast. Maybe a quarter of a speed it would have turned at full operation. But it was turning, the paddles catching the current and rotating steadily in the cold morning light, water sheeting off each blade as it crested and fell. Genny stood at the edge of the yard and stared at it. The water gate had been closed for 12 years. Someone had opened it, or it had opened on its own. Wood warps. Hardware corrodes. Things give way in time. She stood there for a full minute before she moved again. The wheel kept turning. The creek moved past without comment. She found the key to the padlock at the bottom of her coat pocket, where she had kept it for 12 years without once thinking about why. The inside of the mill smelled like her father. Not him exactly, not his soap or his clothes, but the smell that had always surrounded him when he came in from working. Stone dust and creek water and the faint sweetness of mill grain that had soaked into the walls and floors over so many decades that no amount of time could pull it back out. Genny stood in the doorway for a moment with that smell coming at her and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the morning she read the eviction letter. Then she took stock of what she actually had. The ground floor of the mill was one large room that ran the full width of the building. The millstone sat at the center on its iron frame, gray and cold, covered in a film of dust so thick she could write her name in it. The wooden chute that had fed grain down from the upper floor angled overhead, intact but dry and cracked at the joints. Along the north wall, her father had built a simple workbench from planks and sawhorses, and it was still there, one end of it sagging where the sawhorse had shifted. A cast-iron wood stove stood in the corner nearest the door, the kind with the round belly and the flat top, with a stack pipe that ran up through the ceiling. Beside it sat a rusted metal bucket and a short-handled axe her father had used for splitting kindling. The upper floor, where the grain had been stored, was accessible by a steep wooden staircase against the east wall. She climbed it carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. 3 of the steps flexed under her feet, but none of them gave way. The upper floor was empty except for 2 wooden pallets, a coil of old rope, and a canvas tarpaulin folded in the corner. She shook out the tarpaulin, and a small family of spiders dispersed in several directions at once. The floor up here was sound. The roof, when she looked up, showed no daylight coming through. She climbed back down. She did a full inventory of what she had brought. 1 suitcase of clothing, layered for cold weather, because she had packed in November with enough sense to know that wherever she ended up would not be warm. A small bag with soap, a toothbrush, aspirin, a partial roll of antacids, and the bottle of hand lotion she kept in the bathroom cabinet out of habit. Her phone, with 41% battery and no charger, because the charger was still plugged into the wall of the house on Garner Mill Road. Her wallet with $30 and a debit card connected to an account that Owen had not yet managed to access, though she could not be certain how long that would hold. A paper bag from a gas station in Fenwick with 2 granola bars, a packet of peanuts, and a half-finished cup of machine coffee that was now stone cold. The wood stove was her first priority. There was no wood inside the mill, but the collapsed wall of the equipment shed had left a scatter of dry timber across the ground. Old boards split along the grain and weathered down to the core. She carried armloads back to the mill, taking 3 trips before she had enough to feel comfortable starting a fire. The axe was stiff with rust at the head, but the handle was solid, and she used it to split the larger pieces down to a manageable size, working slowly, resting between swings. She was 73 years old and had not split wood in 30 years, and her shoulders told her about both of those facts clearly. But the pile grew, and eventually she had enough. Getting the stove lit took longer than it should have. The flue was cold and the draw was sluggish, and the first 2 attempts produced more smoke inside the room than she was comfortable with before she remembered what her father had always done. Open the door and let it breathe for a minute before closing it down. She tried it. The 3rd attempt caught. She stood in front of the stove with her hands out toward it and felt the first real warmth she had felt since morning. That first night was bad. Not as bad as she had expected, but bad. The stove kept the immediate area around it tolerable, but the mill was a large room with gaps in the siding and no insulation in the walls, and the cold pressed in from every direction that the stove's heat didn't directly reach. She dragged one of the pallets from upstairs and positioned it a few feet from the stove, laid the canvas tarpaulin over it, and put her suitcase underneath to raise one end slightly off the coldwood. She slept in her coat and 2 pairs of socks with her hat pulled down over her ears. She woke twice in the night. The first time the fire had burned low, and she fed it 2 more boards and lay back down. The second time was close to dawn, and the cold had settled into her lower back in a way that made getting up easier than staying down. She stood at the mill door in the gray early light and looked out at the creek. The wheel was still turning. She had survived the first night. She had done it on cold floors and minimal food and a fire she had built with her own hands, and she was still standing. Owen had taken her house. He had taken her money and her security and 29 years of a life she had built carefully and honestly. He had not taken this. She went back inside and put more wood on the fire and started thinking about what came next. The second morning, she made a list. Not on paper, she didn't have any, but in her head, the way she had always organized problems at the county clerk's office when something needed sorting. She sat on the pallet with her back to the warm side of the stove and went through it methodically. What she had, what she needed, what could wait and what couldn't. What couldn't wait was food and water. She had 1 granola bar left and the packet of peanuts, and the $30 in her wallet would not stretch far if she spent it without a plan. Water she could pull from the creek in a metal bucket and boil on the stove top, which she had already done that morning for the first time, watching it roll to a boil before pouring it carefully into her empty coffee cup. It tasted of iron and cold stone, and it was fine. Her father had drunk creek water his whole working life. Food meant a trip into the nearest town. She had driven past a gas station and a small grocery in Fenwick, about 7 miles up the road. She waited until mid-morning when the stove had warmed the mill enough that she felt comfortable leaving it unattended, banked the fire down low, and drove into Fenwick with her $30. She came back with 2 cans of soup, a bag of oats, a box of crackers, a jar of peanut butter, a box of matches, 2 short candles, and a small bag of apples. It left her with $4 and change. She set everything on the workbench along the north wall and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at things when you're trying to feel like they are enough. They were not enough, but they were a start. That afternoon, she began cleaning. It was not a decision she had thought through so much as a thing her hands moved toward on their own. The mill had been sitting and used for 12 years, and the dust and grime had settled into every surface with the permanence of something that had given up expecting to be disturbed. She found an old rag hanging from a nail near the workbench, stiff and gray with age, and she shook it outside and used it to wipe down the workbench surface. Then the windowsills, then the ledge along the wall above the stove. As she cleaned, she began to see the room differently. The walls were wide plank timber, the original boards her grandfather had milled himself from trees cut on the property. They were dark with age, and in places where water had come in through the gaps in the siding, they had gone black at the edges. But the wood underneath was sound, and when she rubbed a section clean, she found a grain so tight and fine it might have come from a furniture maker's shop rather than a working mill. The stone foundation walls that rose 3 feet above the floor on the north and west sides were dry stacked without mortar, fitted close enough that almost nothing grew between them. The millstone itself, when she spent an hour wiping it down with a damp rag, turned out to be a pale gray granite with a surface worn smooth at the center from decades of use. She had not expected any of this to be beautiful, but it was in the plain and specific way that things are beautiful when they were built by someone who cared about the work. She started on the floor next. The mill floor was wide plank like the walls, and it was covered in a layer of old grain dust and grit that had fused over the years into something closer to a crust. She found a stiff bristled brush hanging in the corner near the stove, the kind used for scrubbing, and she got down on her hands and knees and worked the floor section by section. It was slow, and her knees ached, and she had to stop twice to straighten up and press her fists into the small of her back. By the time a light started going, she had cleaned roughly a third of the floor. The difference between the cleaned section and the uncleaned section was visible from across the room. The wood underneath the crust was a deep amber color, the kind that only comes from old-growth timber that has had decades to settle and darken. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She thought about what her father had always said when she was a child watching him work the mill. He had said it more than once. In the patient way, he repeated things he believed were worth repeating. The job is always already there. You're just doing what it asks. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. The mill was not a ruin. It had never been a ruin. It had been waiting the same way a good tool waits on a shelf, ready for whoever picked it up and applied it to the work at hand. All it had needed was someone to come back to it. She relit the candles as the evening dark came in, placed one on the workbench and one on the millstone's iron frame, and ate half a can of soup heated on the stovetop. Then she sat in the amber light of her clean floor and her two small flames and let the day settle over her. Outside, the wheel kept turning. She would be back on her knees in the morning. She already knew it. Her hands were raw and her back was complaining, and she had $4 left to her name. She slept better than she had the night before. It was the wheel that started it. Genny had been at the mill for 11 days when she finally stopped accepting the turning wheel as something she didn't need to understand and decided to find out why it was moving. She had told herself it was warped wood and creak pressure and simple mechanical coincidence. But the wheel turned with too much consistency for coincidence. It moved at the same slow, steady pace every morning when she came out to look at it, and every evening when she checked before dark, and she had spent enough of her childhood watching that wheel to know the difference between a mechanism drifting and a mechanism running. The water gate that controlled flow to the wheel was on the creek side wall of the mill, accessible through a low door that Genny had to duck to pass through. She had opened it once on the first day to confirm the gate was there and then left it alone. Now, she took the short-handled axe handle, which she had been using as a makeshift pry bar for various tasks around the building, and went back through the low door to look properly. The main water gate was closed. She had been right about that. The iron handle was in the shut position, and when she pressed her hand against the gate panel, it was firm with water pressure behind it. Closed. But below the main gate, at the base of the channel wall, there was a second opening she had not noticed before. Smaller, roughly the size of a bread box, fitted with a separate wooden panel that had been cut and shaped with care. It was not part of the original mill design. She could see that plainly because the stonework around it had been disturbed and reset, and the mortar used to seal the edges was a different color from the original. Someone had added this later. The panel had a small iron handle, rusted but intact, and when she pulled it, the panel swung open on a leather hinge that was stiff but not broken. Water moved through the secondary opening at a controlled rate, channeled by a curved stone lip her father had shaped to direct the flow precisely onto the lower paddle of the wheel. Slow, deliberate, enough to keep the wheel turning at that steady quarter speed she had been watching for 11 days. Her father had built this. She sat on the cold ground beside the channel and worked through what that meant. Cornelius had died in October. She had been told by the neighbor who found him that he had been working on the mill property in the days before, which everyone had assumed meant routine maintenance. It had not been routine maintenance. He had built a secondary water channel designed specifically to keep the wheel moving after he was gone. She stayed with that thought for a long time. Then she went back inside and looked at the space beneath the millstone frame with different eyes. The frame was a heavy iron structure bolted to a stone base that rose about 18 inches off the floor. She had cleaned around it but not under it, because getting under it required lying flat on the floor, and there had always been something else more pressing to do. She got down on her stomach now and shone her phone's flashlight into the gap beneath the stone base. There was a wooden box. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, built from the same tight-grained timber as the mill walls, with a fitted lid and a strip of rubber, weatherproofing tacked around the seal. Someone had pushed it back against the far edge of the stone base where it would not be visible without lying flat on the floor and looking directly at it. She worked it out with the axe handle and carried it to the workbench. The lid was tight. She ran a knife blade around the rubber seal and lifted it and found inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, a bundle of papers held with a length of twine. She untied the twine. The first thing was a letter in her father's handwriting, 5 pages on the lined paper he had always used for correspondence, dated 8 days before he died. She read it standing at the workbench with the candle close, and by the 3rd page, she had to stop and press the back of her hand against her mouth and wait until she could see clearly again. He had known he was not well. He had not told her because he had not wanted her to worry, which was so entirely like him that she could not even be angry about it. He had been diagnosed in August with the condition that would kill him in October, and in the 2 months between he had made his arrangements and written his letter and built his secondary water channel and hidden the box under the millstone frame where he wrote that she would eventually look. He knew she would come back. He had counted on it. The second thing in the box was an envelope from a land assessment office in Charleston, dated 6 years before his death. Inside was a geological survey of the Tanner's Run property, showing what the surveyor had identified as a substantial deposit of high-grade silica sand in the hillside above the mill. Commercially viable, the report said. Possibly significant. Her father had never filed the claim. He had written in the margin of the report, in his careful hand, "For Genny, when the time comes." She stood at the workbench in the candlelight for a long time. Outside, the wheel kept turning. It had been turning for her all along. Petra Moss and Callum Finch had been hiking the Tanner's Run trail every November for 3 years running, ever since Callum had read about it in a regional outdoors magazine and convinced Petra it was worth the 2-hour drive from Morgantown. It was not a heavily trafficked trail. Most people who knew about it came in summer for the fishing, and by November the access road was empty and the creek ran cold and fast, and the trees were bare enough to see the ridgeline clearly in every direction. They liked it for exactly those reasons. They came around the lower bend of the trail on a Saturday morning, 17 days after Genny had arrived, and Callum stopped first. He put his hand out to slow Petra without saying anything and pointed toward the mill building. Smoke was rising from the stack pipe, thin and steady. The shutters on the ground floor window nearest the door had been open from the inside. And through that window, in the gray November light, a warm glow was visible that did not come from anything the building should have contained. Petra said, quietly, that someone was in there. Callum said they should probably not go any closer. They stood on the trail for a minute, watching. The smoke kept rising. The wheel turned in the creek below. Then Petra, who worked in social services in Monongalia County and had spent 15 years making judgment calls about when to knock on doors, said she wanted to make sure whoever was inside was all right. Callum followed her down the slope to the mill yard. She called out from the yard, identifying herself, saying they meant no intrusion and were just checking that everything was okay. There was a pause long enough that Callum had started to think no one would answer. Then the door opened. Genny stood in the doorway in her layered clothing with her white hair loose around her face and looked at the two of them with the expression of someone who had been found doing something private and was deciding how to feel about it. Petra told her they had seen the smoke. Genny said she supposed they had better come in. Petra's assessment took about 4 minutes. The 73-year-old woman, alone, had been living in an uninsulated mill building for over 2 weeks in November temperatures. Whatever Petra had expected to find, it was not what she found. The floor was clean and amber-colored in the morning light. The wood stove burned steadily. The workbench held organized provisions, cans arranged in a row, a pot, a cup, the box of matches, and the candles placed where they would be easy to reach in the dark. Against the east wall, raised on the wooden pallet with the tarpaulin folded neatly to one side, was a sleeping arrangement that was crude but clearly considered. And at the center of the room, on the iron frame of the millstone, sat a wooden box with a bundle of papers beside it that Genny had been reading again when they knocked. Callum looked around the room and said nothing for a moment. Petra asked Genny how long she had been there. Genny told her 17 days. Petra asked if she was there by choice. Genny said she was there because her son had stolen her house, and because this was her father's mill, and it was the only property she still owned, and because she was not going to a shelter at 73 years old if she had another option. She said it without any particular heat. It was simply what had happened. Petra sat down on the edge of the workbench and listened while Genny told her the rest of it. Owen's visit with the papers. The title company letter. Jan Fetters laying out the legal reality across her desk above the hardware store. The drive north with one suitcase. The wheel turning when she arrived. The box beneath the millstone frame and the letter in her father's handwriting and the geological survey folded in the envelope marked for Genny when the time comes. Callum had his phone out by the time Genny got to the survey. Petra put her hand on his arm and gave him a look. He put the phone away, but the story came out anyway, the way stories come out in places where people know each other. Petra mentioned it to a colleague. The colleague mentioned it to someone at the Monongalia County Recorder's office who knew a reporter at the Morgantown Dominion Post named Stuart Ackley, who drove down to Tanner's Run 4 days later with a camera and a recorder and spent 2 hours with Genny at the mill. His piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday evening, it had been picked up by the Charleston Gazette-Mail. By the following Monday, it was on 3 regional television stations and a national newswire. The headline that spread furthest was simple. Evicted at 73, she drove to her father's Watermill. The wheel was still turning. Owen saw the story on his phone in the apartment he was renting in Beckley. He knew within 24 hours of the piece running that the power of attorney, the property transfer, and the sequence of transactions behind it were going to be looked at by people with subpoena authority. He called a lawyer that afternoon. The lawyer told him what Genny's lawyer had already told Genny. The documents were technically legal. But technical legality, the lawyer added, was not the same thing as something a prosecutor couldn't build a case around, particularly given the elder financial exploitation statutes that West Virginia had strengthened 18 months prior. Owen's employer in Beckley, a property management company whose owner had read the Dominion Post piece over breakfast, called him into the office on Tuesday and let him go. 3 pro bono attorneys contacted Genny through Stuart Ackley within the first week. 2 of them specialized in elder financial abuse. The third was a property and land rights lawyer from Charleston who had read the piece about the Silica survey and wanted to discuss what a proper mineral rights claim on the Tanner's Run property might be worth in the current market. Genny met with all 3 of them at the mill, sitting at the workbench with the candle lit and the stove going, and she listened carefully to what each of them said. She had always been good with numbers. She understood quickly that what her father had left her in that box was not just a letter and a survey. It was a way back. The mineral rights claim took 8 months to process through the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, during which time Genny stayed at the mill. She had been asked, more than once, whether she wanted to move somewhere more comfortable while the legal work sorted itself out. A nonprofit that worked with elderly housing victims offered her a furnished apartment in Morgantown at no cost. 2 people who had read Stuart Ackley's piece in the Dominion Post wrote to offer spare rooms. A woman from Charleston drove out to Tanner's Run unannounced one Saturday with a casserole and a handwritten note saying she had a guest cottage Genny could use for as long as she needed. Genny thanked every one of them. She stayed at the mill. By the time spring came, the mill was not the same building she had arrived at in November. The gaps in the siding had been filled with timber she had sourced from the collapsed equipment shed, cut to fit and fitted in place with a handsaw borrowed from a hardware store in Fenwick. The floor, all of it now, was cleaned down to the amber grain. The workbench had been rebuilt along its full length using lumber she had salvaged and sanded and set level on new sawhorses. 2 additional wooden shelves ran along the south wall, holding her provisions in a row of creek stones she had collected during her morning walks and arranged without any particular plan, simply because they were good to look at. She had also started working on the wheel housing. The housing was a timber frame structure that enclosed the upper section of the wheel where it met the mill's exterior wall. Several of the housing boards had rotted through and the joints had pulled apart, which meant rain and wind came through in a way that wasn't doing the interior wall any favors. She had no carpentry training. What she had was her father's old toolkit, which she had found in a wooden chest under the workbench on her fourth day, oiled and wrapped in cloth the way Cornelius had always kept his tools. She worked from the outside in, pulling the damaged boards, cutting replacements, fitting them one at a time. It took her 3 weeks. When she was done, the housing was sound, and the interior wall behind it was dry for the first time in what she guessed had been years. The mineral rights settlement came through in late June. The silica deposit her father had identified turned out to be larger than the original survey had suggested, and the company that held extraction rights to the surrounding area had strong reasons to secure the Harshaw claim before anyone else could. The figure they settled on was not a fortune by some measures. By Genny's measures, at 73 years old with $4 left to her name the previous November, it was more than she had ever expected to see at one time. She paid the 3 pro bono attorneys. They told her that wasn't necessary. She told them she understood it wasn't necessary, and she was doing it anyway. The case against Owen did not go to trial. The West Virginia Attorney General's office investigated the power of attorney transaction under the Elder Financial Exploitation Statute, and Owen's lawyers negotiated an agreement that included full financial restitution, a period of supervised probation, and a formal finding that he had exploited a vulnerable adult. His name was on the public record. Genny was asked by a reporter whether she felt justice had been served. She said she felt the matter had been resolved. Those were different things, and she knew it, but resolution was what she had, and she was not going to spend energy chasing the other. What she spent energy on was the mill. Over the following year, with the settlement funds and the help of 2 contractors from Fenwick who had followed the story and offered their rates at cost, the mill was restored. The millstone was cleaned and balanced. The water gate was rebuilt. The wheel housing was reinforced properly. A small addition was built onto the east side of the building, a single room with a proper bed, a bathroom with running water, and a wood-burning stove that threw heat like it meant it. The original mill room remained exactly as Genny had made it during those first months. Wide plank floors, the workbench along the north wall, the candles placed where she had placed them, the creek stones on the south shelf. She began milling grain again in the spring of the following year, using heritage corn varieties sourced from 3 farms within 20 miles. Small batches, nothing like what the mill had done in her father's time, but enough to sell at the Fenwick Farmers Market and 2 specialty grocers in Morgantown who had been looking for exactly what she was producing. On a morning in late April, 2 years after she had pulled into the mill lane with a suitcase and $30 and no plan, Genny stood at the creek bank and watched the wheel turn. The water was running clear and fast with the spring thaw. The housing boards she had cut and fitted herself were holding. The paddles were clean. She was 75 years old. She had lost a house and a son, and 29 years of a life she had built on the assumption that the people she loved would not hollow it out from the inside. She had also found, at the bottom of a stone building in the West Virginia hill country, something her father had left running specifically so she would know where to look. The wheel had been turning for her all along. She just hadn't known it yet. Some losses open a door you didn't know was there. Genny hadn't chosen to walk through it. She had been pushed, but she had walked through it on her own 2 feet, and on the other side was a mill and a creek and a row of creek stones on a wooden shelf and grain drying in paper bags, and a morning that was hers entirely. Owen had taken her house. He had not taken her home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.